Get ready, today we're going to leave my home in Yonkers, New York, and head into Manhattan to one of the greatest Bible libraries in the entire world, the Mendel Gottesman Library of Yeshiva University at 185th Street and Amsterdam Avenue. Welcome to 929 Chapters. I'm your host, David Z. Moster, PhD and Rabbi. So as you can see, I've got a great stack of books in front of me today. And what I'm going to do is show you how I and many other scholars try to compare and contrast the Bible with the literature from the ancient Near East. So I'm going to break this video up into 7 parts. For the first part, we're going to look at a book called Ancient Texts for the Study of the Hebrew Bible by Sparks. This will lead us to 2 reference works, Context of Scripture, and Ancient Near Eastern Texts and Pictures related to the Old Testament. Then finally, we're going to dig even deeper for an article by Jakob Singh and a first edition tablet by Pobo. Then we're going to get very modern by looking at the Cuneiform Digital Library Initiative, CDLI. And then finally, I'm going to bring it all together with some Bible verses at the very end. What we're looking at here is a book by Kenton L. Sparks called Ancient Texts for the Study of the Hebrew Bible. I bought it for about $20 on Amazon. I'll have a link to it in the description of this video. And this book was published in 2005, and really since then, for me, it has been a must-have. Really fantastic book. Now there are thousands, hundreds and hundreds of thousands of ancient Near Eastern texts. What Sparks does is he only tells you the really important ones for the study of the Bible. So for example, chapter 2 is wisdom literature that relates to a book such as Proverbs. Chapter 3, he has ancient hymns, prayers, and laments that relates to a book such as Psalms and the book of Lamentations. And then, for example, in chapter 4, he has love poetry, and that relates to a book such as the Song of Songs. So, since we're working on the book of Genesis right now, I thought it would be interesting to try and find a text that relates to the book of Genesis. Now, the beginning of Genesis is about creation, so I wanted to study chapter 10, which is about myths. And I want some of the very oldest myths, so we're going to look at section 10.1.1, Sumerian myths. When we look on page 307, what we have here are the Sumerian myths. I picked one of them known as the Eridu Genesis on page 310. And what Sparks will do is tell you what this text is, how it relates to the Bible, and then he'll tell you where you can find information about it. What we can see here is that Sparks is pointing us to some texts. And here he has in translations, he tells us to go to COS 1.158. COS stands for Context of Scripture, and it's these 3 big books right here. A great title, Context of Scripture. What it does is it gives you so many ancient Near Eastern and Egyptian texts that have to do with the Bible. It's divided into 3 volumes. The first one is Canonical Compositions. The second one is Monumental Inscriptions. And then the third one is Archival Documents. Now, lucky for me, I actually have this entire 3-volume set on my computer in a computer program called Accordance, so we could take a look at it on our screens. Over here, I wish we could make this section bigger, but what I'm showing you is the table of contents for the Context of Scripture. So let's take a look at section 1.158, which is going to be the Eridu Genesis. So it's going to be in Sumerian canonical inscriptions, going to be a divine focus, it's going to be a myth, and we're going to get the Eridu Genesis 1.158, and we're going to click on it. Great. And so what we see here, translation by Jakob Singh of the Eridu Genesis. And here in the Context of Scripture, you're going to get a nice brief introduction. Here we see that the fragment here translated was written at some time around 1600 BC, and so on and so forth. So let's jump into the text of the Eridu Genesis. So I'm just going to point out a few key lines of this text. When An, Enlil, Enki, and Ninhursag fashioned the dark-headed people, the Sumerians, they had made the small animals that come up from out of the earth, come from the earth in abundance, and so on and so forth. So this is just a brief mentioning of the creation of humankind as well as animals by the gods. So at the beginning we have a goddess named Nintur, and what she wants to do is give out cities to the first men, the earliest men in Mesopotamia. The firstling of those cities, Eridu, she gave to the leader, Nudimud. Now, Eridu in other texts is also known as the oldest or probably the first ancient Mesopotamian city. In this text also, we see that it's an ancient city, it's the first city. The second city, Bad Tibira, she gave to the prince, and the sacred one, the third one, Larak, she gave to Pahilsag, and so on and so forth. And so what Nintur is doing is she's giving out the first cities to different kings. Then we get this interesting line here. These cities, which had been named by names and had been allotted half-bushel baskets. What does it mean that these cities had been allotted half-bushel baskets? I don't know. Context of scripture doesn't really tell me, so keep that in mind. We're going to try and figure that out as we go along in our journey today. After a break in the text, we get the story of the god Enki telling a king of Eridu, Ziusudra, about the impending doom of a flood. Enki says, "May you heed my advice. By our hand, a flood will sweep over the cities of the half-bushel baskets." Remember that half bushel? Keep that in mind. What is that? And the country. The decision that mankind is to be destroyed has been made. This verdict cannot be turned over. The world is going to be destroyed by flood. Then we have a break in the text, and then the flood comes. All the evil winds, all the stormy winds gathered into one, and with them, then the flood was sweeping over the cities of the half-bushel baskets. Keep that in mind again, half-bushel baskets. For 7 days and 7 nights. After the flood had swept over their country, after the evil wind had tossed the big boat about on the great waters, the sun came out spreading light over heaven and earth. Ziusudra then drilled an opening in the big boat, and the gallant Utu sent his light into the interior of the big boat, and then Ziusudra goes on to give some offerings. The king was butchering oxen, was being lavish with the sheep, and so on, and then we get the break in the text. So this is the Eridu Genesis. We saw that there's a creation of man and animals by gods. We saw that there's a mention of the creation of the first cities. We saw a flood. We saw a flood survivor on a boat. And we saw some sacrifices. And we also had a question about those half bushels. We'll get to that in the future. So this is a really nice introduction to this Eridu Genesis text. Context of scripture and sparks really go hand in hand with each other. Now, another important book, Ancient Near Eastern Texts and Pictures Related to the Old Testament by Pritchard. This nice 3-volume work. This book, which came out in 1950, was hands down one of the most important books in biblical studies until Context of Scripture came out, and many people had access to other newer versions of the texts. So you'll often see in older books references to ANET, Ancient Near Eastern Texts by Pritchard. Just like Context of Scripture, it tells you many different types of ancient Near Eastern texts, such as myths, epics, and legends in the first section, legal texts in the second section, historical text in the third section, and so on and so forth. The Eridu Genesis can be found on pages 42 to 44, and as you see here, just like Context of Scripture, it tells you a lot of introductory text, and then it gives you a translation. But bear in mind, this translation came out in 1950, whereas there have been updated dictionaries, there have been people reading this translation and correcting things, so it's to be taken with a grain of salt, but still very good to have on your shelf. And also another thing that makes the Ancient Near Eastern text really cool is that it has this second volume, these pictures, which before the internet and websites like BiblePlaces.com, this book would actually give you fantastic photographs from museums and museum pieces around the world. Okay, so now that we've done the first three, let's move on to an article by Jakob Singh. In our book by Sparks, Ancient Texts for the Study of the Hebrew Bible, he tells us that there are texts and translations if we want to go a little bit deeper into the text. And we see here a text by Thorkel Jakobson, the Eridu Genesis, in JBL, the Journal of Biblical Literature 100. So here it is. If you have university access, you can really pull this up off of the website JSTOR. What we see here is that we have a nice article about the text and also the translation itself. And it's more in-depth and detailed in the context of Scripture. So just a few things to point out about this. The first one is that, as you can see here, in footnote 6 here, before the translation, what Jakobson is going to do is actually give you the actual Akkadian, Old Babylonian text, the words that he found on the tablet, which is good if you understand Akkadian, you can see how he is translating the work. And then he gives us some nice commentary. For example, what the bushel baskets were. And he basically says that in Sumerian times, money wasn't really existing, or if it was, it wasn't really big yet. So before money, you were doing bartering. You would trade each other in half-bushel baskets. So that's talking about cities being the first place to have money and monetary exchange. So we just learned a whole lot from that article by Jakobson, and we want to go even deeper. So we're going to use Sparks, and he's going to tell us that there is an original publication in 1914 by Arno Pobel entitled Historical and Grammatical Texts, PBS 5, that stands for Publications of the Babylonian section of the University of Pennsylvania Museum. Since it's from 1914, this book is in the public domain and you can get it for free on Google. And what we're looking at here is that Pobel actually gives you what he calls an autographed plate, which is a hand-drawn copy of the tablet. What you're able to see is the actual cuneiform wedges of the script. So when Pobel tells you what he thinks the text says, and you kind of are scratching your head and you're like, that doesn't sound right, you can actually look at the actual tablet and figure out exactly what you think it says, and you could say, maybe that wasn't the right sign that he picked. I would have picked a different sign. So what we see here, the text was a 6-column text, 3 on the obverse and 3 columns on the reverse, and the top half of the obverse was broken off, which means that the bottom half of the reverse was broken off. That's because an ancient tablet wasn't like a modern page. Here we have side 1 of the page, and we turn it to the other side of the page. But an ancient tablet was actually, you would have obverse and you would flip it over to reverse. So that whereas the top of the obverse is broken off, it's the bottom of the reverse that's broken off. Another cool thing that Pobel does is he gives you the transliteration of the Akkadian, and he tells you what Akkadian words he sees on the tablet, and then he gives you his own translation. This is actually helpful if you're comparing and contrasting what Jakob Singh, how he understands the text, versus how Pobel originally understood the text. So this is just another way to go deeper into the Eridu Genesis. So we've looked at an article by Jakob Singh, and we've also looked at a first edition tablet by Pobel. But this isn't the only way to look at the actual cuneiform Akkadian Old Babylonian text. If you really want to go deep into it and you study Akkadian, then you want to go to the Cuneiform Digital Library Initiative. The Cuneiform Digital Library Initiative is a website. It puts actual photographs of cuneiform tablets up online from multiple university archives. When you're searching the CDLI, it's a little difficult to find exactly what you're looking for often. You really need to know the exact call number and so forth. So what you can often do for a famous text, and if you're studying the Bible in light of the ancient Near East, there's a good chance you're looking at a famous text, you can just Google. So for example, you can Google Eridu Genesis CDLI, and then someone will tell you where in the CDLI to find it. So let's take a look. What we see here is our text. It is Arno Pobel, PBS 05, 1914, number 1. That's what we have. And then also there's some more information that makes it interesting. Like over here, it calls it the flood story. At the bottom, there's a nice picture of the tablet itself. And not only do we have the obverse and the reverse of the tablet, we also have the top and the sides. So you get multiple angles for the tablet. And when we click on it, we can actually get a really nice, clean, clear, high-definition image of the Eridu Genesis. So, if you disagree with Pobel and you're like, Pobel's transliteration and Jakob Singh's transliteration, they got the cuneiform a little bit wrong. I think they saw 2 wedge marks when really I see 3. You can go into CDLI and offer a new reading of yourself. You can really dig deep here. So that was our brief introduction to the Cuneiform Digital Library Initiative. Now what I want to do to end this study of the Eridu Genesis is to now look at the Bible in light of everything we've just seen. So let's take a look at a few verses. We see in Genesis 1:27, Vayivra Elohim eta Adam b'tzalmo, and God created man in his image. B'tzelem Elohim bara oto. He created him in the image of God. Zachar unikeva bara otam. He created them male and female. So we have God creating in Genesis, just as we saw the gods creating in the Eridu Genesis. Then if we move into some other verses, such as in Genesis 4:17, we have the phrase Vayihi bon ha'ir, and Cain built a city, Vayikra shem ha'ir kishem beno Chanoch, and he named the city like the name of his son Chanoch, Enoch. So here we have Cain building a first city. We also have in 10 verse 11, Min ha'aretz hahi yatsa Ashur, and Assyria left that land, Vayivan et Ninveh, and he built the city called Ninveh, Ve'et Rechovot Ir, and the city called Rechovot Ir, Ve'et Kalach, and the city of Kalach. So just like in the Eridu Genesis, we have the earliest cities being attributed to ancient figures. And then, just like in the Eridu Genesis, when there's a flood and a person who survives the flood, we have in Genesis 6:17, God speaking, Va'ani hineni mevi et hamabul mayim al haaretz l'shachet kol basar asher bo ruach chayim mitachat hashamayim. Kol asher ba'aretz yigva. And I, behold, I am bringing a flood of water on the land to destroy all flesh that has in it the spirit of life from everything underneath the heavens, everything on the land, it will die. V'hakimoti et briti itach, and I will establish my covenant with you, with Noah. Uvata el teva, you will come to the ship. Ata uvanecha v'ishtecha u'neshei vanecha, you, your children, your wife, and the wives of your children, itach, with you. Just like we had in the Eridu Genesis, we have this story of a person surviving the flood, and then finally, just like we saw in the Eridu Genesis where there were sacrifices at the end after the flood, we have in Genesis 8:20, Vayiven Noach mizbeach ladonai, and Noach built a altar to Yahweh, Vayikach mikola behema hatahora, and he took from all of the pure animals, umikola of hatahor, and from all of the pure birds, vayal olot bamizbeach, and he offered burnt offerings on the altar. So what we see here is that just like the Eridu Genesis, the book of Genesis has certain themes, such as the creation of man and animals by gods, the creation of the first cities by important people, a flood survivor on a boat, and sacrifices. And the reason we were able to learn all this was because we started with ancient texts for the study of the Hebrew Bible by Sparks. That led us to Context of Scripture and ANET. And then finally we dug a little bit deeper by looking at the articles of Jakob Singh and Pobel from 100 years ago. And then finally we were able to look at the high definition images of the Cuneiform Digital Library Initiative. And so this is how scholars such as myself find ancient Near Eastern texts that are relevant to specific biblical passages, and then by digging deeper and deeper, we are able to look at the actual cuneiform, study the Akkadian, and look at how exactly to compare and contrast an ancient text such as the Eridu Genesis with an ancient text such as the Book of Genesis. For more on the Bible and the ancient Near East, be sure to check out my website, 929chapters.com, and I look forward to seeing you for another special topic.